heroes and villains, welcome to Multiverse. Today we are going to answer a very important question. What is the multiverse? And I'm not talking about the channel, I'm talking about the idea of the multiverse itself. About a year ago, we had the Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness movie, and it was clear from seeing a lot of YouTubers talk about it that a lot of YouTubers had no idea what the multiverse actually is. Although at the time I did not really know that, I hadn't seen the movie just yet, so I was watching all the reviews and I did not know if the reviewers did not know what the multiverse was, or if maybe the movie gave them the wrong idea of what the multiverse was. Sadly, studios nowadays are very proud to say that they're using people who don't know anything about science fiction, or in this case about superheroes, and sadly it shows in the work. Very often you can see that the people who made the movies, who wrote the stories, who wrote the scripts, have no idea about what they're doing. It is clear that they have no real knowledge of the field they're working in, even though they are working in that field. The best example I can probably think of is J.J. Abrams. J.J. Abrams, in pretty much every interviews when he made Star Trek 2009, he was very proud to say that he never was a Star Trek fan, he never liked Star Trek, he was more of a Star Wars fan, and you could tell watching the film. In every frame, you could tell that J.J. Abrams had no idea of what Star Trek was about, had no real knowledge of Star Trek, and no real understanding of what Star Trek actually is. And sadly, it is something we see more and more on YouTube from a lot of YouTube reviewers. Basically, there's a lot of YouTubers who probably started talking about things like pop culture, and then when pop culture shifted into right into the realm of comic books, I guess when that happened, a lot of those reviewers had no choice but to switch their focus into covering superhero movies or even superhero comics. Sadly, it is painfully clear that a lot of those people have no real knowledge of superheroes, of comics, or both. And that also applies also to science fiction, fantasy, but today let us focus on superheroes, and more importantly, let us focus on the multiverse. Now, when I was watching the reviews for Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, it was cringe. There's no other words to say that. I saw way too many YouTubers who were talking about how America Chavez was coming from a different multiverse, or how the Illuminati was coming from another multiverse, or how the first Doctor Strange we see, I think it's a Defender Doctor Strange, was coming from another multiverse. At every turn, it was obvious that they had no idea what a multiverse is, or what it was actually. Now, there are some YouTubers who sometimes seems to show a little understanding of comics, at least a little understanding of some comics. Like, for example, there's a reviewer who seems to know comics from the time when Brian Michael Bendis started writing comics for Marvel. But anything before that, the reviewer is kind of lost on that front. So some of the YouTubers seems to have some knowledge of modern comics, but no real knowledge of the history of comics, and no knowledge of the classics. And I guess in order to be able to truly understand the multiverse, you have to go back to the classics. Heck, I was 10 years old when I learned about the multiverse, and it was simple enough to understand, at least I thought it was, but it turns out that it seems to be very complicated because, again, a lot of YouTubers don't seem to know anything about the multiverse, and don't seem to even grasp what it's supposed to be. So I guess we could see this video as a sort of a Multiverse 101 video. And so let us start with where it all started for me, the Flash of Two Worlds. That is where I first learned about the idea of the multiverse. I guess it was the first step into learning about the multiverse theory. The simplest way to explain the multiverse is a line from the French TV show, "There's more than one of everything." It's pretty much that simple. So way back when, in the 40s, there was this comic called The Flash, and in the 40s the Flash was Jay Garrick. Sadly, in the 50s were not very kind to comics, especially superhero comics, and sadly our friend Jay Garrick pretty much disappeared over time. The comic was cancelled, and the character pretty much disappeared. And the same happened with a whole bunch of other characters. We had Green Lantern with Alan Scott, Al Pratt, the Atom, and more. There's only a handful of characters that lasted through the 50s, Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman being a few of them. But then at some point, editor Julie Schwartz decided to bring back The Flash, and Julie Schwartz and Carmine Infantino pretty much redesigned, created a new version of The Flash, which was Barry Allen. And you can still see the classic costume designed by Carmine Infantino is pretty much still the classic costume that is being used today. Although it's a tiny bit different, the belt is usually a bit different, and now they've added a whole bunch of useless lines to the costume. But overall, last I checked in the Flash TV show, they were still pretty much using that costume. But then a question started being asked: what happened to Jay Garrick? In the early issues of the Barry Allen Flash comics, basically Jay Garrick was a comic book character. It was a comic book that young Barry Allen was reading when he was a kid, and it is what inspired him to take the mantle of the Flash when he gained super speed. So originally, that was pretty much the link between Barry Allen and Jay Garrick. Barry Allen read the comics featuring Jay Garrick when he was a kid, and that was it. But then at some point, not sure why exactly, someone had the idea of let's bring back Jay Garrick. So they created the story The Flash of Two Worlds. In a nutshell, by accident, Barry Allen was able to travel to another Earth, a second Earth, where Jay Garrick was the Flash. So at first it pretty much was that simple. There was Earth 1 with Barry Allen, there was Earth 2 with Jay Garrick, although ironically enough it probably should have been the other way around because Jay Garrick was there first. But the Barry Allen comic was the current comic at the time, so that became Earth 1, and the older Earth, the Earth from World War II, became Earth 2. And the explanation again was simply enough. Basically the Earth was vibrating at different speed in different universes, so Earth 1 was vibrating at a certain speed, Earth 2 was vibrating at another speed, and Barry Allen, by vibrating his molecule, was by accident able to switch from Earth 1 to Earth 2 without meaning to at first. And the way to explain the Flash comics on Earth 1, basically the writers on Earth 1 were dreaming about Earth 2, and they were dreaming about the stories, the adventures that Jay Garrick had on Earth 2. And strangely enough, when Jay Garrick on Earth 2 decided to retire, that is when also the Flash comic ended, because the writers could no longer dream about the adventures of Jay Garrick, seeing how he had retired. So it was a simple idea explaining why we had a new Flash, and still keeping the older Flash around, and also being able to have a team up between the older Flash and the newer Flash. But of course, that would not be the last time those two would team up. And in their second team up, we were also introduced to the Justice Society of America. It was only in flashbacks, but it was the first time I was introduced to those characters, especially Alan Scott. It was a bit strange. It was only a panel, although a bit later I think we see the whole group in another panel. So I only had a couple of panels with Green Lantern Alan Scott, but I fell in love with the character right there and then. And it was a bit strange later on when I discovered that there was a new Green Lantern as Hal Jordan. To me, this was Green Lantern, and also ironically enough, way back when, the comics I was reading as a kid were black and white comics. So I had no idea at the time about the funky coloring of the Alan Scott costume. It's only years and years later that I finally saw that costume. I think I probably saw it a bit before Crisis on Infinite Earths, but not that much before. At the latest, I saw it in Crisis on Infinite Earth, but I'm pretty sure I saw a digest-sized comic in colors a few years before that. But anyway, the first time I encountered Alan Scott, it was in a black and white comic, and it's only later that I saw that some of the coloring for that costume are a little bit funky, I think. So I guess I can see why when they redesigned the Green Lantern with Hal Jordan, they decided to add more green to the costume, although the costume wasn't exactly green, it was green, black, and white. But I guess it was a bit more green than the red, green, and purple costume that Alan Scott had. But then, of course, at some point, they had to have the Justice League of America meet the Justice Society of America. And it's something that started becoming pretty much a yearly event. So pretty much every year there would be some sort of quote-unquote crisis event. So in this case, it was a Crisis on Earth 1. But then later on, there was a Crisis on Earth 3 with the evil crime syndicate of America. And basically every year there was a new crisis involving characters from different Earths. and it snowballed from there. That's when the basically what became Earth 1 and Earth 2 actually became the multiverse and an infinite number of universes. That is part of what drove me nuts in some of those reviews. They kept on saying that characters came from another multiverse. No, the multiverse is an infinite number of universes. There doesn't need to be more than one multiverse. There's only one multiverse with an infinite amount of universes, and characters come from a different universe, not a different multiverse. And America Chavez can travel from universes to universes, not from multiverses to multiverses. Although it becomes a bit more complicated with Infinite Crisis, so maybe that's where some of the issues come from. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. So basically, we had the Justice League of America who would meet the Justice Society of America basically once a year, or sometimes they would meet other characters from other universes. As I mentioned, at some point they would meet the evil crime syndicate of America from Earth 3. At some point they would meet the Freedom Fighters from Earth X. Or sometimes we would have events like at some point Superman would meet Captain Marvel, aka these days Shazam. So basically there would be sometimes stories where Captain Marvel and Superman would actually meet, and Captain Marvel came from the Earth S. Now the naming convention was a bit weird at first because again it started with Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 3, but then it quickly devolved into Earth X, Earth S, Earth C for the Charlton Earth, where Blue Beetle, Captain Atom, and the Question all come from. Now, at the time, I did not read any of those comics. Sadly, I did not know anything about Blue Beetle way back when. I did not know about the Earth X, Earth S. I did not know about the Crisis comics. It is something I discovered way after reading Crisis on Infinite Earth. Basically, Crisis on Infinite Earth was my first Crisis, and technically my second Crisis. We'll get back to that in a minute. But when it comes to DC Comics, I truly became a DC fan with Crisis on Infinite Earths. Worlds would live, worlds would die, and nothing would ever be the same. Although at the time, I wasn't reading that many DC comics. I knew about Batman and Superman like most people. I had a few comics from those. I mostly had comics from The Flash. I had roughly maybe 30 comics from The Flash. It was pretty much the DC series I had the most comic about. I'd read a bit of, for some reason we had the Karate Kid comic that was translated in my neck of the wood at the time. There was roughly, I had 15, 16 issues I think of Karate Kid. Then we started getting Legion of Superheroes, the Teen Titans, and probably something else I forget about. But overall, I did not read that many DC comics way back when, until I read Crisis on Infinite Earths. Crisis on Infinite Earths introduced me to the vastness of the DC Universe, to the richness of the DC Universe, and to a lot of the history of DC Universe. Sadly, it's also the comic that got rid of a lot of that. Basically, at some point, they decided that the DC Universe was becoming too convoluted with all those Earths. There was also worries about the brand dilution, which I can sort of understand. So they decided to simplify everything. They got rid of the infinite universes. So they decided to simplify everything until there was only one DC Earth left. But originally, the idea was it was fairly simple when you think about it. Basically, when there was the Big Bang, there was the Big Bang that created not just the universe, but it created the multiverse with an infinite amount of Earths, all vibrating at different speeds. So events would happen differently on different Earths. So again, on Earth 1, we had pretty much the main DC universe. On Earth 2, we had the DC universe from World War II, or from the 40s upwards. Then we had Earth 3, which was the evil crime syndicate of America. We had Earth X, which was the Earth where the evil Germans won the war. And you had Uncle Sam and his freedom fighters who were still fighting the good fight. We had Earth S with the Shazam family. We had the Earth C with the Charlton characters, and more. So it was a simple enough idea, but again, some people, the powers that be at DC decided that it became too confusing, or they were a bit worried about diluting their brand a little too much, which is understandable. Like we can see it happen right now with Batman. DC are so reliant on Batman these days, and they're producing so much Batman content or so many Batman comics that the brand is suffering right now. So at the time, it was decided that they would simplify everything. So they had this big event, this 12 issue maxi series that pretty much got rid of the multiverse and replaced it with a single DC universe. And that lasted for about 2.5 seconds. And basically was supposed to solve a whole bunch of problems. Like basically there was too many different versions of Atlantis in the DC universe. There was too many different versions of the same gods, of the same characters. So they decided to pretty much simplify everything, like to bring back Superman to be the last son of Krypton. Because at that point there was a Supergirl, there was a Krypto, there was all the super pets, there was a whole city of Kryptonians, there was the Kryptonian criminals. So there was a whole bunch of other Kryptonians in Superman. So they decided to try to simplify everything, and like in the case of Superman, they decided to try to bring back a Superman to being the last son of Krypton, which again lasted for 2.5 seconds, because a lot of the stuff they tried to simplify actually made things more complicated than anything else. Again, in the case of Superman, they tried to bring him back to being the last son of Krypton, but then it had a ripple effect on the Legion of Superheroes. The Legion of Superheroes were created with the idea that they were inspired by Superboy. But in that new version of Superman, and Superman being the last son of Krypton, also John Byrne, when he reinvented Superman, decided that Superman never was Superboy. He just became a Superman. He kind of followed the model of the Richard Donner movie, where there never was a Superboy. When Superman decided to become Superman, he just was that, Superman. But not having Superboy pretty much messed up the Legion of Superheroes. So they had to create a pocket universe where there was basically another Earth where Superboy actually existed. So the Legion of Superheroes were not inspired by Superman from the main Earth. They were inspired by Superboy from that pocket Earth. I guess you can see how already from the start, right off the bat, it started making things more complicated as opposed to making it simpler. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. You can also imagine from the marketing department point of view, basically they were losing a lot of their brands, like Superboy was a brand, Supergirl was a brand, and very quickly they added Superboy back with the Pocket Universe, but of course that wasn't enough. So when they had the Death of Superman event, they brought back, in quote unquote, they brought back 4 Superman to replace him, and one of those became the new Superboy. And in the case of Supergirl, very quickly they created a new version of Supergirl, which came from, again, the Pocket Universe. There was this character that they called the Matrix, who would then become, she became Lana Lang, but then she became Supergirl, and again, it was a big mess. It became very convoluted really fast, and it became a big mess. But basically, they used the Supergirl Matrix to try to bring back Supergirl. Probably, I would guess, to appease the marketing department, because again, the marketing department lost probably a lot of toys in the Crisis on Infinite Earths, so they had to try to find some ways to bring some of those back. Not to mention also characters like Hawkman. With Hawkman, they at first with the new DC universe, Hawkman was pretty much the same as he always was. But then they had this mini series called the Hawk World, which pretty much reinvented Hawkman and Thanagar and a whole bunch of other stuff. And that pretty much broke Hawkman for pretty much forever after that. Jeff Jones at some point pretty much did a good job fixing Hawkman and explaining the whole history between Hawkman being a space cop coming from a planet called Thanagar, but also Hawkman being an Egyptian prince. And then there was this whole story about reincarnation that pretty much sort of explained all the inconsistencies or all the changes that were made to Hawkman after Crisis on Infinite Earths. So Crisis on Infinite Earths, that was supposed to fix the DC universe, ended up pretty much breaking it as much as it did fix it. And then they tried to fix it again and again and again. They tried to fix it for the first time they tried to fix it again was with Zero Hour. And again, they kind of sort of fixed a few things. They broke a whole bunch of other things. And then they did the only thing they could truly do. They brought back the multiverse, sort of. And they had this event called the Infinite Crisis. And by the end of the Infinite Crisis, the multiverse was back. Or at least a version of the multiverse was back. For some odd reason, at that point, they started obsessing with the number 52. Someone decided that 52 was meaningful for DC somehow. They had the series called 52 that explored basically a year of stories of, let's say, lesser important characters like Booster Gold or Starfire, and I forget who else, Animal Man, Elongated Man. So for some reason, at some point, 52 became a meaningful number for DC for some reason. And when they decided to bring back the multiverse, they brought it back, but instead of bringing back the infinite multiverse that they had before, they brought back a multiverse with only 52 Earths. I guess they were trying to bring back the multiverse, and their attempt to limit it at 52 was probably their attempt to try to keep it a bit controlled so that it wouldn't go out of control. But that ship had sailed already way back when. Basically, not long after the multiverse, not long after Crisis on Infinite Earths, when the multiverse was gone, we still had alternate stories, but they would label them as Elseworlds. Technically, the first Elseworld was Gotham by Gaslight. It was basically what if Batman had lived 100 years before, and what if he met the evil Jack the Ripper. And it snowballed from there. We got a whole bunch of Elseworlds from there on. And of course, later on in retroactively, comics like The Dark Knight Returns were labeled as Elseworlds. So the multiverse was back. It was supposed to be limited to 52 universes. But of course, at some point, they had to create the Dark Multiverse. So basically, it was a darker version of the multiverse, where you had a whole bunch of different versions of Batman, who were evil, of course. If you guys saw the Dark Metal comics, or the Dark Knights Metal comics, these were pretty much it. They were pretty much stories from the Dark Multiverse, and in the Dark Multiverse, you would have Batman and Barry Allen would end up being fused together, mixed together, and they would become the evil Red Death. Or Batman would become the Joker, would be infected with some Joker toxin, and become a Batman-Joker hybrid, and we got the Batman Olafs, and a whole bunch of other variations like that. Which sadly ended up doing exactly what people feared would happen way back when. Basically when they were worried that the multiverse would be diluting their brand. The Dark Multiverse pretty much did that for Batman. It was more than that. It was just more than just the Dark Multiverse and the Dark Knights, but having a whole bunch of variations on Batman all at once. That was pretty tough for the brand to take, although at first it was fairly successful. And that's why also DC, and even DC Universe Online leaned on the whole Dark Knight's idea. They leaned on having a whole bunch of different variations of Batman, because at first it did seem to be successful. But sadly it did seem to hurt the brand also a bit, although it was more than just that. Let's say we got a lot of Batman stories for quite some time that were not, let's say, not the best stories. But anyway, so to get back on to the multiverse idea, basically they created a second multiverse called the Dark Multiverse. So I can see why it might cause some confusion, at least with people who are just familiar with the modern comics, who are not very familiar with the classic comics. But the version of the classic comics is closer to the actual definition of the multiverse. Basically, infinite realities with infinite possibilities, where anything and everything pretty much ends up happening. So imagine any choice you ever made ever. Imagine if every time you made a choice, it created two realities. The one choice that you decide to make, which is your reality, but then an alternate reality where you made a different choice, where you made the other choice. And now multiply that by every time someone made a choice, and that would lead to an infinite number of universes, an infinite number of realities, where all those choices happened. So technically there is one multiverse with an infinite variations of realities. So the next time that you watch a YouTuber that talks about Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, and they talk about America Chavez that travels from multiverse to multiverse, no, replace multiverse by universe. America Chavez travels from universe to universe within the one multiverse. The same time as if they mention that the Black Bolt is a Black Bolt from a different multiverse, no, he's Black Bolt from a different universe. Or even Baron Mordo. Basically, Baron Mordo in the movie is not the same Baron Mordo as we saw in the first Doctor Strange movie. He's actually Baron Mordo from a different universe. Again, not a different multiverse, a different universe. But multiverse, I hear you says, What about the Marvel multiverse? As surely the Marvel multiverse and the DC multiverse are not the same thing. Actually, yes, they are. They've crossed path. They did cross path before, so we do know that they do exist within the same multiverse, and in a roundabout ways, so does the Image universe. Basically, we had Batman meet Captain America, so that pretty much shows us that the Marvel universe, the Marvel multiverse, and the DC multiverse is the same multiverse. But we also had Batman meet with Spawn, which again shows us that Captain America, Batman, and Spawn all live within the same multiverse. Heck, we even had the Punisher meet Archie from Archie Comics. So if we look deep enough, we can see that it is all connected. And it is all connected within one multiverse. And in case you're wondering why did I call this channel Multiverse, maybe you didn't hear the story before. Basically, originally when I started this channel, I was toying with the idea of covering multiple games, not just DC Universe Online. So if I had called the channel, let's say, the DC Superhero channel, what happens when I cover, let's say, a Marvel game? Or what happens when I cover a game that has nothing to do with superheroes? Let's say, what happens if I cover a game like Baldur's Gate, or Destiny, or Defiance? So at the time I came up with the name Multiverse because it would give me the freedom to cover any game I wanted, and it would still make sense within the context of the channel. Multiverse pretty much encompasses everything. So if I made a channel called Multiverse and I covered a game like DC Universe Online, but then I covered a game like Destiny, and then I covered a game like Minecraft, it all would work within the context of the multiverse. Or even within the context of DC Universe Online. Like, what if I make a video about DC Universe Online and I create a character like Spawn or Deadpool or the Phantom? Heck, the first character I used to cover DC Universe Online was the Wolverine. To me, I'm not a Marvel fan or a DC fan. I'm a comic book fan or a superhero fan. So to me, the idea of having Wolverine team up with Batman to fight the evil Joker, I thought it would be a cool idea. And sadly at the time, I completely underestimated the cleavage there was between the DC fan base and the Marvel fan base. So creating the Wolverine as my first character was a bit of a mistake. And since we're back about talking about Marvel a bit, I did mention that Crisis on Infinite Earth was not quite my first crisis. My first crisis was Crisis on Other Earth. Basically, it was a crisis where the Avengers would meet the Squadron Supreme. For those who do not know, way back when they created a group, actually the Squadron Supreme wasn't even the first group. Way back when, I think it was Roy Thomas who created a group called the Squadron Sinister. It was pretty much a pastiche version of the Justice League. The idea was to have the Justice League fight against the Avengers, and obviously that was not an option. At least at the time, that wasn't an option. And later on, way later on, we got the JLA Avengers comic, but at the time, that just wasn't possible. So Roy Thomas created the Squadron Sinister to fight the Avengers. But then later on, they created an alternate version that came from another Earth called the Squadron Supreme. Basically, the Squadron Supreme were the heroes of their Earth, but they were modeled after the Squadron Sinister. So it was basically what if the Squadron Sinister, evil villains modeled after the Justice League, were actually the good guys. So here we actually had a good version of the Justice League versus the Avengers. Although within the context of the story at first, they acted a bit like villains, because they were basically the antagonist to the Avengers in that story. But it turns out that they actually were good guys. They just had, I guess, different objectives, different points of view, which brought them clashing against the Earth's mightiest heroes. But at the time, Steve Englehart and George Perez were pretty much fans of the Justice League. They were pretty much fans of the crisis events in the Justice League. And I guess this was their way to be able to, in a roundabout ways, contribute or be part of those yearly crisis event that DC had way back when. And they were able to get their own Justice League versus Avengers way before we got the actual comic. There was a Justice League Avengers that was supposed to happen in the 80s. George Perez had penciled roughly 20 pages of the story before the project sadly never happened. But then in the early 2000s, we finally got the JLA versus the Avengers, and it was a pretty awesome comic. So So there you go, guys. So that is what the multiverse is: an infinite number of realities where pretty much anything can happen when there is more than one of everything. So the next time that you see a YouTuber that talks about Doctor Strange from a different multiverse, or they talk about the Illuminati from another multiverse, or they talk about America Chavez that can travel across different multiverses, tell them to go read The Flash of Two Worlds. That should give them a small crash course as to what the multiverse is.